So the title of this panel is Embryonic Limits. We're shifting into a nearby domain of science and technology, which is importantly in all sorts of regards using and in certain respects converging with the questions around genome editing, exploring the other panels. But of course, the purpose of this meeting is to think about not just sort of what limits should be placed on whatever practice, but thinking about how we think about limits, the drawing of limits, the draws the limits, and what terms those limits are drawn, limits between what and what, et cetera. And so this is a really interesting and valuable domain for thinking about those questions. Because, of course, the 14-day rule has been mentioned several times. This is a quite long-standing, quite solid limit. The notion that human embryos should not be cultured in vitro beyond 14 days of development. That limit is sort of is now subject to question and to some degree to revision, and it may or may not stand as Francois suggested. But of course, at the same time, there have been developments in this domain that some of our speakers will speak about with technical capacities that have made a kind of limit on a simple linear path no longer so straightforward and dependable. The development of techniques for producing embryo-like, what are sometimes called synthetic embryos or embryoids, embryo-like constructs in the laboratory that mimic naturally conceived human embryos. And there's a sort of question of the boundary between the artificial and the natural, and the artificial becomes sufficiently like the natural that it strays into a territory of moral concern. Also, the combination of human and animal cells in the production of embryonic chimera. And so, we're talking not just about the 14-day limit, but the limit between living and dead, between artificial and natural, between human and animal, between part and whole, quite fundamental and quite old and quite morally significant limits that are all simultaneously in play in this rapidly emerging domain of science and technology. So it's in the spirit of reflecting on those limits that we want to have this conversation to learn not just about the issues at stake in this domain, but also the ways of thinking about them. The modes of drawing boundaries, the ways in which boundaries that seem solid in one moment suddenly become fragile and can collapse. So we have a really excellent panel, and I'm just going to briefly introduce each of our speakers so that we can get on with their comments. Our first speaker will be Sheila Jasanoff, who I think at this point needs no introduction, but she is the Forsheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies here at the Harvard Kennedy School, director of the Global Observatory, has a list of accomplishments that goes on and on and on, and so I will just simply leave it at that. Our second speaker will be Jianping Fu, who is professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, and also holds courtesy appointments in biomedical engineering and cell and developmental biology. He was just telling me that he began as a mechanical engineer developing the apparatuses for cell culture and has moved from applied to basic, discovering the study of development itself using these apparatuses is where his interest has taken him. I had a conversation with, which he actually remembers, I didn't think he would remember, maybe 5 years ago or something in the hallway at some bioengineering meeting. One of the most interesting and thoughtful conversations I've had about this domain of emerging science and technology. So we're really glad to have Jianping here with us. Our third speaker will be Ubaka Ogbogu. Ubaka, all right, pretty good. He's associate professor in the faculty of law and a CAPS research fellow in health law and science policy at the University of Alberta. In addition to doing really interesting work on ethically doing social implications of emerging biotechnologies, he served in many important public roles in ethics and sort of ethics and governance roles in Canadian research and beyond, including serving on the task force of the International Society for Stem Cell Research that recently revised guidelines around all of the forms of research that we're talking about, which George Daly mentioned in the opening remarks. And finally, our final speaker will be Saha, our third partner in crime and observatory leadership, who is associate professor of bioengineering, medical history, and bioethics, at the University of Wisconsin. He does cell and gene therapy, CRISPR stem cell research, bioengineering, but he also does STS and bioethics, and has been, a long-standing conversation partner for me especially, and also for Sheila. We met each other when we were both. He was a postdoc, I was a graduate student, and in some sense, this collaboration was born in that moment, in this very building, more than a decade ago. Chris, however, in a sort of performance of the power dynamics of big science, has been called to a call with his NSF program director / paymaster, and therefore, when NSF calls, you go. So he'll be out of the room for the next 10 minutes or so, but we'll be back to join us shortly. So with that, I will hand it over to Sheila.
Yeah. Thank you, Ben. I don't know why there's partners in crime, but not partners for progress, partners in virtue. There is partners in health, I guess, but that's something else again in this neck of the woods. But I hope that our partnership is not entirely criminal, subversive maybe. So I want to shift the conversation a little bit, but I'm really eager to hear what my co-panelists have to say about this. So some of what interests the observatory is not merely the what is, but also the why is it this way. So not just the choice of language or the choice of categories or whatever, but what are the forms of authorization and reasoning that lead to particular categories and particular choices and particular modes of speaking become authoritative in some sense. So when we were discussing how to put together a session on limits when it came to embryo research, because as you've already heard, the 14-day rule is probably the most powerful example of a consensus having been formed around a rule governing biological research at the frontiers of humanness. I was wondering about the modes of authorization that I myself have witnessed in my research, and it's multiple. So it's worth thinking a little bit. I invite you to think not only what are these people saying, which is very important, but what are they drawing their authority from when they say these things, and what authorities are they occluding or foregrounding when they draw on particular reservoirs of reasoning to justify what they say. So Peter's already said that he cut his teeth in this area in the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, and here are two very, very distinguished women, alas now both late, but they headed that HFEA. And it's interesting, you can't imagine an American regulatory body of this sort being headed by a distinguished moral philosopher and then a Renaissance historian of science and knowledge. So there's already a difference in the institutional context of this body in the early days when it was getting going in some sense. So Warnock, whose work has already been cited, and Pete has specifically cited one passage. My favorite passage out of all the reams of stuff that I have read about this has to do with a debate in the House of Lords in which Warnock comes on cutting through the binary debate about the pre-embryo, is it life, is it not life, and says something completely different, which has always resonated with me. And it's worth reading it and reflecting on it. So there is a very noble prayer frequently uttered in my college chapel. So she is at this point mistress of a college in Cambridge, University of Cambridge, that we may be given the grace to distinguish things that differ. I, as a member of my college chapel, pray this most fervently because, and this is where I invite you to reflect, I believe that it is our moral duty to make a distinction in this case between the pre-embryo and the embryo, which is to become individual and to act on this distinction. So if you're trained in STS and are trained to think of the ways in which value systems and states of the world enmesh and support and justify each other, you will see that sentence as a moment of co-production, because values and ontologies fit together in a certain sense. But you will also notice the analytic philosopher talking there, because the state of the world is given, and there is a duty that is consequent on the ontology of the world being a certain way, that morality should follow ontology. So that is a particular view of cause and effect that, one might wonder about. So I was, of course, being also a historical linguist by training, and somebody who's learned a lot of languages in various ways, I was wondering, what is this noble prayer that she's talking about? And so I did a bit of research and discovered that, to the best of my knowledge, which I think is correct, she was referring to this prayer of Thomas à Kempis. And again, it's worth listening to it even in English. So grant me, O Lord, to know what is worth knowing, to love what is worth loving, to praise what delights you most, to value what is precious in your sight, to hate what is offensive to you. Do not let me judge by what I see, nor pass sentence according to what I hear, but to judge rightly between things that differ, and above all to search out and do what pleases you through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, so you can forget the Jesus Christ for the moment, or you can remember him for all I care. But the point is that there is a shift in this poem. There is a shift from to know what is worth knowing. So it's not knowledge for its own sake, it's worth knowing. The purposes come from somewhere outside of ourselves. Françoise, this is part of what was in your human-centric question, I think, before. To love what is worth loving, but again, the purpose of the love comes from somewhere else. To praise what delights you most, again, if something is delighting somebody, it's value and it's coming from somewhere else. But in Warnock's rendition, it becomes to judge rightly between things that differ. So it's like Christian mysticism giving way suddenly to Platonic specificity, and the nature suddenly gets cut at the joints. And there are the joints, and somehow the divine inspiration of the purposes disappears in the textuality of the reading as it is transposed into 20th century discourse. And then implicitly, the ontological question becomes a primary thing about the primitive streak, as you pointed out. And, so it becomes a thing about biological development. And we forget to ask, did the Lord delight in the primitive streak? I mean, what was this all about? I mean, or are we imbuing the Lord with our own values? In which case, I mean, there's a different set of questions to be asked about morality, whether it's Christian or not. So I find that very passage to be extremely resonant, and resonant in ways that, among other things, made me look into what I think are the sources of authorization in Britain and how they differ from authorization in America. So here's Lisa Jardine, a very distinguished historian, and she also, calls upon, I mean, so she was of Jewish heritage, but, so to justify what the HFAA was doing at a certain point, she gave this interview to The Guardian, and, says this: St. Augustine, who I greatly revere as the great father of the church, he believed that the child became human when it kicked in the womb, so that would be about 19 weeks. And, only 21st century Catholicism has this problem. That is fundamentalism about when life begins. And if we could just roll the curtain back to when people were talking more sensibly, but it's a reservoir of ancientry. It's a historical pushing back of the line of human reason, where the fundamentalism becomes the aberration, and the taking for granted of the things as they really are becomes, the sort of right place land in terms of drawing the moral line. But it's very persuasive sounding. I mean, so she respects everybody, and in which case we'd all be able to talk to one another. How could one disagree that we should all be talking to one another? And it's a very long lineage, and it's full of characters whom one should greatly respect. And, you know, just this is an interview, but if you are into language, you pick up who I greatly revere and who I greatly respect as, you know, almost poetic repetition for the sake of emphasis. And by the end of it, you are respecting them too, right? You know, how could you but? And it doesn't matter, you know, where in the world you are yourself locating yourself. There is something to respect here. Well, so fast forward to, I think, the kind of moments that Françoise was talking about in her tracing of language, where the word consensus is a kind of floating signifier, as I think today's discussion has amply pointed out, that by saying consensus, you're not saying whether it's consensus on result, or whether it's consensus on reasoning, or whether it's simply consensus on all agreeing to talk to one another and accepting the word of the author or editor at the end of the day as the consensus, because you're too tired to argue or you didn't have enough time to edit the last version of the report or whatever. I mean, you know, so consensus, we've discovered, can be a multitude of things. But there is a huge difference between consensus being a scientist's consensus and a societal consensus. And here in this passage, which is written by scientist explicators of why the 14-day rule should shift, you see a different discourse. So science is changing and regulations need to adapt. We started off the morning by George Daly, Dean of Harvard Medical School and a member of almost every influential committee that has been active in this area, telling us that bedrock principles exist and science changes. And he is colleagues with and committee members with these people who are saying science changes and regulations need to adapt. And so if regulations are the embodiment of bedrock principles, then you might imagine that the regulations do not need to adapt. It's the science that needs to adapt to the bedrock principles. So here are people in the same discursive community who seem to be saying rather different things about what authorizes what. And it's this question of the what authorizes what that I think we are grappling with here. So there's insufficient global governance of assisted reproductive technologies, ARTs, but the 14-day rule is one example of how that, you know, could come about. And then, you know, in the second paragraph, there's a further invocation, a modern day reproductive asilomorph. So both me and the chair of this panel have written, especially the chair of this panel, most extensively, on how asilomorph has become a historicized thing that has come to stand for something that a sociological history of asilomorph never would ratify as being what asilomorph had been about. And so it's taken as a successful example of scientific self-regulation because it was so open and inclusive. So it wasn't open and inclusive, and whether it was successful or not depends on the kind of thing Catherine was talking about. That is, the breadth of the domain across which this consensus obtained. It certainly was very successful in allowing genetic engineering to go forward in a particular time and a particular place. But has it been successful even with regard to quelling the problems around assisted reproductive technologies? In the last few weeks, I've been struck by the resurgence of a story that I kind of knew about, which is surrogate babies in Ukraine. I don't know how many of you have followed that, but the 14-day rule and the opening of the door to assisted reproductive technologies obviously did not do anything about sociological imbalances, the cross-border trade in, you know, the bodies of the people who are going to bear the children, and now, you know, in time of war, the question of what happens to these babies who suddenly, you know, whose entire family status has been left disrupted. And you know, these are small tragedies of war, but they're big tragedies of our not being able to fit our ontological systems together with our moral valuational systems in some way. So I see this as a kind of contradiction that in terms of authorization and how ontology relates to values that it behooves us to think about. And then, I don't know how many of you have actually read this leaked draft of the Alito opinion. I have to confess that overturning Roe v. Wade, I have to confess that I had to really push against a mental resistance to even put myself through the exercise of reading this thing. But if you want fundamentalism on the non-science side, go read it. So this is just a quotation, but it's replete with these things. So this emphasis on this text is Alito's, Genesis Alito's. And so also, and he's quoting Blackstone, and you go back to Blackstone if you're a common lawyer, and we've heard about the differences between common law and civil law already, but this is a source of law. And we shouldn't forget that law and science came thousands of years after law and religion. Let me say tablets are older than the laws of evolution or whatever. So that is scientific law modeled itself on divine law. So also if one gives a woman with child a medicine to procure abortion, and it operates so violently as to kill the woman, this is murder in the person who gave it. And then it adds emphasis added. Notably, Blackstone, like Hale, did not state that this proto-felony murder rule required that the woman be with quick child, only that she be with child. Okay, so there's boundary work being done to say that the line between pre-quickening and post-quickening is an artificial line if one wishes to take law itself as the authorizer of moral action. And, to be sure, the little quoted bit is talking about the mother-to-be being killed by the administering of the poison. But if you are scientists in this room, or if you're non-scientists in this room, if you're women, if you have had children, if you want to have children, it doesn't take a big stretch of the imagination to ask how the morning after pill fares in this, scenario of administering poison to mother-to-be, right? And also, if you read that the woman with quick child is not what it says, only that she be with child, then also I think you're led to speculate on the consequences of this reasoning, this kind of reasoning, for what is at stake for the future of all kinds of research where you might be depending on the 14-day rule. So, I think that these different forms of authorization, each of which has some fundamentalist claim logic behind it, force us to consider what those sources of authorizing wisdom or authorizing history or authorizing text or authorizing whatever philosophical delineation of the world may be. And with that, let me pass it on Jianping to you.
Thank you, Sheila. My name is Jianping, faculty member at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. So today is my great pleasure to be here. Very happy to be invited. So as one of the researchers working in this, I would say, emerging area, where now people realize that using human stem cells, in particular human pluripotent stem cells, in those embryonic stem cells, as well as induced pluripotent stem cells, now we are able to generate human embryo-like structures, or for simplicity, just called embryo models, and to allowing us to study human development. Therefore, such knowledge will be useful for advancing regenerative medicine as well as reproductive medicine without using natural human embryos. So this is the whole area, I guess, where I guess the premise for this emerging area. All right. So in fact, so I guess as a researcher working in this emerging area, I guess my task here is to provide you, I guess, to update you where this area is, where it is right now, and where it's heading. Where is it heading to next? So in fact, this area emerged over roughly, I would say, last 10 years, largely driven by the fact that scientists have been frustrated about the fact that we could not study human development. without very, I would say, convenient access to human embryonic tissue samples, especially in the US. So therefore, for example, and I quote it here, you can see the highlighted sentences from one of the prominent scientists working in this emerging area, Ubaka from Rockefeller University. So what he was saying that we know a lot more about many animal models. We're talking about frog, chicken, and mice than we know about ourselves, the genesis of human being. And then over the last 10 years, there was a very significant technical advance in terms of ex vivo or ex uterus or in vitro culture of human embryos. Now, in fact, so when 14-day rules was developed a long time ago, and people wasn't thinking the possibility that in vitro human embryo culture can go that far when human embryo will enter post-implantation developmental stages. But now, technically, over the last 10 years, it's become a possibility. And then over the last 10 years, I'll explain more about different type of models that have been developing using human stem cells, embryo models. So people realize that such embryo models, people are very excited about the promise of these models in terms of promoting fundamental understanding about human development, as well as advancing reproductive and regenerative medicine. In fact, you can see that on the right-hand side of the slides, this is a commentary written by a few scientists, myself included, highlighting the premise, the biomedical applications that can be generated by this research area. Right, for example, by treating infertility or otherwise improving IVF procedures. And in fact, I think another long-term goal for this area is the big picture is whether we can generate functional human organs by continuously developing such synthetic human embryo models. Let me move on. Okay, so here's a slide summarizing the existing models that have been reported by scientists using both, in fact, using both animal cells, I'm talking about mouse stem cells, as well as human stem cells, to generate different type of models, model different aspects of mouse and human development. When I say different aspects, more or less means that different stages of mammalian development, mouse and human development, from either pre-implantation, from when the human embryo or mouse embryo form a blastocyst, up to early organogenesis, which means that the blastocyst will undergo gastration and the germ layers will develop, and possibly the neural system, the central nervous system, will start to form soon after gastration. So this is where we are. In fact, we have many different type of models, and from both mouse stem cells as well as human stem cells. I understand for this audience, we pay more attention to human development. And different models will be able to allow us to study different stages, different aspects of this human developments. And so in fact, just for clarity, there are a few, I would say, compared to mouse stem cell based embryo models, we have less advance in terms of human embryo models. So there are only a few ones, but I will go through them very quickly and by highlighting the potential implications. So the first model, in fact, the first human embryo model was reported back in 2014, when somehow people culture human stem cells on a flat 2D surface. The human pluripotent stem cells, embryonic stem cells, under the treatment of chemicals, they just differentiate, they turn themselves into different cell types. But where they are doing that, they somehow organize themselves into different domains and providing some type of experimental system allowing us to study human gastration as one of the, in fact, human gastration is one of the bottlenecks, in fact, for successful pregnancy. So people are very excited about it. And after that, so I should point out, so this particular first model was conducted completely on 2D surface. At that point, the scientists were already start getting very excited about the possibility to generate embryo models without using natural human embryos to study human development. But nonetheless, because these are 2D models, I guess people are less concerned that such embryo models will be too similar to natural human embryos. Because we understand actual human embryos, they develop in 3D. They develop into three-dimensional three-dimensional structures, and eventually will implant, right, and continue the development. But nonetheless, through some surprising, I would say, discoveries, unexpected discoveries, soon after you can see the second model. That's the model on the right, on the upper right. This is the 3D model developed from my lab through some unexpected discoveries and was unintentional. So we realized that such human stem cells, pluripotent stem cells, when you culture them in suitable conductive environments, because they do retain early developmental potential, because these stem cells, they mimic the pluripotent cells very early in the human embryo. They have very early developmental potential. So therefore, they can self-organize and develop into three-dimensional structures bearing significant similarity to paired implantation human embryos. So I'll kind of go over a little bit more on that. And really start to trigger the concern, or I would say the discussions about now the human stem cells can be utilized to generate such embryo-like structures, and there's such close similarity to intact human embryos, or a part of intact human embryos. What we can do with them, and where are the ethical considerations or implications? But nonetheless, let me move forward. Last year, and there were three, in fact, more than three, quite a few high-profile publications, and these are the three papers I listed here, published by Nature. For the first time, people just use human stem cells to generate what we call complete models of human embryo, which means that such models contain all the cell types that are required for successful pregnancy. And but fortunately, and well, I wouldn't say fortunately, but nonetheless, so these models certainly have a lot of limitations, and because from the studies, as it is from the existing studies, they don't show much developmental potential, which means that they cannot continue to develop much further. But terrifying, I see people are really working on that right now. All right. So going back to the ISSCR 14-day rule, and we understand that, in fact, after the emergence of the first few models, and when people already start talking about the possibility, so that possibility of for scientists to generate complete human embryos models, human embryo models. So obviously, the scientists were a few scientists as well as ethical experts will convened and to task to revise and update the ISSCR guideline and on human embryo research as well as stem cell-based embryo models. So you can see from the slide, we have this updated guideline and published last year. And unfortunately, in fact, I can't read the sentences. In fact, I put on the slides, sorry. I couldn't read very clearly. But nonetheless, you can see that. So in the guideline, ISSCR guideline on embryo research as well as stem cell-based embryo models, there are a few categories. The first category describing research activities exempt from review process. So which means that scientists can conduct those research activities without any, say, review process. So in fact, it turns out embryo research or embryo model research, as long as those embryo models are considered as incomplete models, which means that they don't contain all the cell types required for successful pregnancy. So such research activities can exempt from any review process. So the second category requires the research activities to be reviewed by suitable, say, regulatory bodies. And so it turns out any embryo models, if they contain all the cell types, so these are what we call integrated complete embryo models. And such research activity can be conducted as long as they are approved by suitable regulatory bodies. And there's no stop sign, I would say there's no regulation saying that when such research should be stopped. And right. And obviously the 14-day rule now is under category 2. And so I would say, if you conduct research for human embryo research within 14 days, then such research is permissive, but again, require approval. Then the last one, category 3, and these are prohibited, not allowed, and and we cannot. Relevant to human embryo model research, any human embryo models, regardless is incomplete or otherwise complete, cannot be used for human reproduction purpose, or otherwise be more specific, cannot be implanted into human or otherwise animal for continuous development. All right. So when I was preparing my slides, I got an email from the committee asking me to think about discuss, I would say, constitution and the recognition of ethical limits for human embryo models. And I did spend some time, and again, I think the sentences here I listed here, the points here, bullet points listed here are my personal views, but some of them are shared by many of my colleagues, and many of them shared by my colleagues, and nonetheless, and now I think it's a consensus. I'm using the word consensus among the researchers. The human embryo models, and they deserve careful deliberation and for their embryonic rights and the ethical limits. Similarly with human embryos, they should share similar considerations. And again, the consensus from the research area is none of these embryo models should ever be used for human reproduction purpose. Maybe all of them should directly. Yes, mostly here, sorry. So maybe all limits and considerations for natural human embryos should be directly applied to embryo models. Well, if I think I put a question mark there and that's for discussion. But then, as we discussed here, the 14-day rule has been more or less, lifted. So where are the next steps? So these are the questions I guess need to be discussed. I'm sure will be discussed. Okay. All right. So going back to the embryo models, where the science is heading, as I highlighted last year, there were very significant advance in this area. People first time reported using human stem cells to generate complete human embryo models containing all the cell types necessary required for successful pregnancy. So this is you can see that this is a cropped image from News and Views written by me highlighting those papers. So these are the first complete models of the human embryo. So I also highlighted one sentence here, and you can see that I would say to some people, the study of human embryo models will be less ethically challenging than the study of natural human embryos themselves. However, others might view human embryo research as a path towards engineering human embryos. So I was just trying to highlight, to really highlight the possible, I would say, ethical implications. In my view, the news and the views. But nonetheless, going back to what I would really like to talk about, where the science is heading, and people are really making a lot of effort trying to generate more complete and more functional human embryo models, and such complete and human, I would say, such more complete and functional human embryo models, and very likely will be able to develop further along the human developmental axis, from pre-implantation, post-implantation, castration, up to early organogenesis. Again, I think people are making tremendous progress, very likely, I think, on the horizon, and we're going to soon see some, I would say, central nervous system tissues and neural tissues derived from, or I would say, contained in such embryo models. And also, so embryo models I should highlight that a lot of scientists, myself included, we recognize and acknowledge the fact that we totally agree with that. The scientists don't have to have complete human embryo models to study certain fundamental and oftentimes most important scientific questions. You don't have to have the complete human embryo model to study certain questions that you are interested And but there are many technical barriers scientists are trying to address. And for the sake of time, I don't need to go over the technical barriers, but non-technical barriers that the scientists working in this area were fully aware of and trying to address is the fact that I think we all believe that communications between all stakeholders are very important. That's the reason I'm here. And also, in fact, clear guidelines and from funding agencies and regulatory bodies are very important. In fact, many of you might not be aware of the fact that, for example, funding agencies such as National Institute of Health, they are fully aware of the emergence of stem cell-based human embryo models, and they are very cautious in terms of funding such activities. In fact, many of the models I discussed here, they are not fundable by NIH. Okay. Well, I don't know how much time I might already spend over time. Okay, nice. All right. I'll just spend two minutes really just summarize what I was going to talk about, what I'm going to talk about in the last two slides. I want to say that going back to the questions raised by the community, I want to say that some of the embryo models, they were developed in the first place as very unexpected discoveries. So for example, here, I just want to highlight maybe the video you see that playing on the screen. And you can see that, in fact, this is one example from my group. Human pluripotent stem cells, somehow when we just capture them in 3D, unintentionally, because we were working on something else, we were thinking about some other questions. Somehow you can see that the human pluripotent stem cells, they just start to organize themselves and develop into, you can see if you follow the first video here, you can see that the cells are organizing. These are cluster of cells. They start to open a cavity in the center. If you pay close attention, you notice that some cells in the cell cluster, they start to become different. They become flattened and squamous. They're differentiating. They break symmetry. They form a bipolar structure, really mimicking early embryonic development. So what I'm trying to say is some of the embryo models are discovered or were established from in a very unexpected way, highlighting we still don't know, we still have I would say there are a lot more to learn about human stem cells or human development. There's a lot uncertainties. But there are some models that are designed to be complete embryo models. So scientists were making tremendous progress effort by designing the experiments, and they are making progress, they have their own agenda, and they are making embryo models to mimic better continuous development of complete human embryos. With that, I would like to close my talk, and thank you very much for your attention.
It's time to wrestle it next. Hi everyone, thank you for inviting me to do a talk here today. So I'm going to spend about roughly 10 minutes, so in my world, a very short amount of time, discussing two things with you. The first is, as Ben mentioned, I was a member of the ISSCR task force that recently released those revised guidelines. So I feel I should comment on that a bit. And then I will then go to what I actually prepared to talk to you about, which is two things. The first is I'm going to try and historicize limits by reflecting on some lessons that emerged from the debates over the use of embryos for research. And then I'm going to pick up on Sheila's talk about sources by arguing that sources are incomplete and that is actually a problem for how we talk about limits, or generally how we talk about emerging technologies and the ethics around them. So I don't want to stand in here as the person representing the ISSCR. I am not. I was invited to this meeting to be part of the task force. The task force had several working groups who did different things. I was not the 14-day rule working group, so I have nothing more to say on that. I just was not a working group. It's not a question that interests me much because I think the 14-day rule is a rule of convenience in many ways. And like most rules, they're bound to change at some point, and how they change, we haven't really thought deeply about how they change and why they were there in the first place. So that's just to say I have nothing more to say on the 14-day rule. In Canada, where I come from, it's illegal to do research on an embryo beyond 14 days. As a lawyer, that's all I can communicate to you. In Canada, you can't do it. And I doubt that the SSCR rule will change the Canadian rule. It's not going to happen. So that's it about my role in the SSCR. I contributed my expertise, and in fact, some of the things that I contributed, and that's not to say I disagree with the rule one way or the other. The things I contributed didn't actually make it into the draft eventually, so it is what it is. Okay, so I'm going to start by historicizing limits by reflecting on some lessons that emerged from the debates over the use of embryos for research. So the first thing I want to urge you to think about is that limits are nothing new. We've seen them before. We've seen them in the arena of gene editing. We've seen them in embryo research. But they are, in fact, very rare in science. They don't arise in most of basic scientific research. Sure, you have regulations over research. You have, boring stuff like safety codes for labs. You have operational safety matters. You have routine research ethics that REBs or IRBs in the US have been doing for a very long time. But you don't talk about is it out in much of science, and they usually come up with a reason. In the embryo context, of course, we have to have a discussion in that context about what's in or what's out, because it's embryos. Embryos have always been controversial. And so if you're going to do anything around embryos, you're picking up on the abortion debate, you're picking up on all of these debates about the embryo. So that's, I think, tailor-made for controversy. And what that tells me is that the application of limits, or this question of what's in or what's out, is a reflection of how certain types of new scientific events unfold, or even just how newness unfolds in the public imagination in relation to something. So we should really think we're covering a very small world here. Much of engineering happens without really deep questions about is this morally right or morally wrong, and so forth. And that brings me to this quote. Where's the quote? That one over there, which I put up here, because it's my attempt to, I'm attempting to use this quote to sort of capture how I think the question of limits unfolds in the public imagination when it comes to certain technologies. This is a quote from an esteemed and dear colleague from Canada, Basa and Kemapas, in a piece she wrote about policymaking and poetry, which I find very interesting, and that has this quote, which talks about the fact that it's actually a trajectory in terms of how the public sees certain kinds of scientific events. It could be embryo research, it could be gene editing, but when it is the kind that attracts the question of limits, you're going to see this kind of trajectory. The first thing you see is repugnance. People are like, what is that? Maybe we should just put a stop to it, right? When I teach about this quote in my class, I use the iPod as an example. I remember very clearly the very first time the iPod, the music thing was mentioned. There was actually repugnance at that. People were like, what? 1,000 songs in that? Very soon they're going to be putting in our heads. And then, they'll put it in our brains, and then when you shake your brain, you start playing, I don't want that. It's too much. So there's that repugnance, and it's a reaction to newness. And then there's protest. And at this stage, you might see some people saying, let's just ban it, or let's have a moratorium, or let's do it with it and never see it again. And in this, you start to see ideas around what Professor Evans described earlier as that kind of slope, right? Some things come in at certain points in the slope and they're either accepted or, but they'll later eventually be accepted. And then there's acceptance at some point, and hopefully dynamic policy built on principles and vision, which is why I think, what we're doing here kind of reflects this latter end of it, where people, the repugnance has sort of died down a little bit for some things, and then there starts to be some discussion around whether or not we need to create policies to somehow manage the situation. Sorry, I gotta get back on my notes. Now, I think this trajectory is very reflective of what happened in the embryo research arena, except that, with the repugnance and the protests, we then had the authorities making legislation. And if you're a lawyer, you know that once it goes to legislation, it becomes a question of whether it will ever change. In Canada, when we enacted laws in 2004, that's where the law is still at. It doesn't matter whether the science moves forward. It doesn't matter whether scientists find some other way to do it ethically. The law is stuck now, and it will take a while to get back on the legislative agenda, if it does at all. And when it does, who knows what's going to come out on the other end? So it's just stuck. And so that's where it's at. And beyond that, you can have people reflecting on how to do it ethically, on how to get around the social backlash or the social protest. But ultimately, it depends on how power is exercised to deal with it, because it may never change. At least in the Kenyan context, what we have is something stuck in time that is not changing anytime soon. So if you look in the embryo research arena, most of you in the room will already be familiar with policy approaches to embryonic limits. We basically have two approaches that came from that if you're historicizing embryonic limits. The first is prohibitive, as we have in Canada. For the most part, some things are prohibited, some things are allowed. In some countries, some things are just prohibited. Some of things may be prohibited by not providing funding to do it. And then there's other places where the second approach, which is to subject it to some form of regulation. Now, of course, there are jurisdictions that have no approach at all. They haven't thought about it, and I'll come back to that. Some of those jurisdictions may subscribe to some kind of international legal or political order, like something the UN said, but they haven't actually thought about it locally, and they don't have anything about it to say about it. So I think what's really interesting about this approach is that they can have serious impact on how the research proceeds. But what I'm interested in terms of these limits that are embedded in these approaches is how they are negotiated and imposed. Because I think the way they are negotiated and imposed reflect or affirm two deeply problematic philosophical and practical matters. The first one is that there's a global consensus on and global participation in formulating these approaches. I think that is very far from the truth. And even within nation states, even within the administrative nation states, I'll suggest that there's no consensus of any kind, or even you don't even have people, enough people within nation states in the room to talk about the question of limits. So in many ways, limits are a reflection of who's in power and who's exercising power. And the second is that limits serve to discipline scientific progress by reflecting societal morals and values. I think that's also wrong. I think, in fact, they reflect selective worries of a form of epistemic hegemony, people who, again, have power and who have assumed that the research is itself necessary and inevitable. I question whether that's the case, and if you accept that certain forms of research should be done, and then you're asking yourself, should we impose limits on it? I think you may not be the kind of person who's thinking, maybe we shouldn't do that research at all to begin with, or we shouldn't be talking about this because there are other problems we need to focus on. The second point, which I'll close with, is the question of sources. So in terms of sources, Sheila's pointed us to certain sources, but I also want to encourage us to think about something I think is arguably more consequential, which is the limit that results from exclusion from the global scientific and related policy activities of certain communities in a way that creates epistemic exclusion, policy development exclusion, epistemic injustice, and reflects a wealth needs divide. In essence, what I'm saying is that there's a limit that's inherent in some people not being in the room when these matters are discussed, some communities not being involved in the research, some communities not having to benefit from the research, and some communities having to bear the burdens of that research being done. Whenever you fund something and you support something, there's something else that's not being supported. And I think that's a limit that is not theorized or discussed at all. It is not discussed even as a limit, but I think it's limiting in the sense that if you're not participating, then you're somehow never going to benefit from that thing. And so you have a limit that is inherent in your lack of capacity or ability to engage in that. Now, there actually, I'm not just saying this to draw out the point that is limiting, but I think there are consequences to that kind of limitation or limit. The first is when you're not participating, there's a possibility that you're not regulating. And if you're not regulating or even thinking about it, then you then become a site, as we've seen in the context of embryo research, for rogue activities. Because you're not participating, if you're not involved in the global scientific enterprise in relation to what we're discussing here, then there will be no need for you to develop regulations. And if you don't, at some point somebody will figure out that that's a good place to go to avoid the regulations you've made in the United States or in Canada. And we've seen this. It's a huge problem in the stem cell research arena. We've seen rogue practices develop, and people jump around from places where they feel they're going to face a ton of regulations to places where they think there are no regulations, where they can proceed with doing whatever they're doing. This then places a burden on those communities to suffer from something because they have been excluded from the discussions around how that thing should be regulated. The second kind of consequence is that any benefits that arise from workarounds that scientists develop is also lost to these communities. So one of the things that happen with this limits on use of embryos for research is that scientists figure out a way to work around that. Many models developed as a result of avoiding the use of embryos for research. Scientists, like iPS cells, for example, and whatever benefits are going to come from that, that will be lost to communities that don't participate in this. So I want to urge us to think about, or to start thinking about limits as not only something that is inherent in your capacity or ability to do something, but it's also inherent in your lack of capacity or ability to do something, and devote some time to reflecting on this and the consequences for things I mentioned before, which include epistemic justice and policy development justice, and this wealth needs divide, which is going to see one part of the world benefit from these technologies and other parts of the world or communities within even affluent nations not benefit from this research. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Okay, hello. So I'm going to try to keep this short. It's always about to start, but just to get to discussion, because I think we've had a lot of nice content to get input on. So I'm on a panel here on embryonic limits, and it is a little bit ironic because all of my work is on somatic cell gene editing. So we do all of the work that I do in my lab here in this building shown at Madison, Wisconsin at Institute for Discovery is to apply genome editing techniques either to cells we take out of the body and engineer, or to directly inject genome editors into, say, the eye or the brain to do in vivo editing. And even though I'm in that field, this idea of having limits on embryonic genome editing is, I think, a site of consideration for really myself as well as many other practicing researchers in the field. And I think the idea here of having and thinking about what limits mean, I think is what Betsy said. For those who are impacted by it, is something I wanted to give you some insight on, because at some level, it is myself, my trainees who are interpreting the limits, and then developing work practices to still go through the type of work they're supported to do while respecting and being responsible in the best way possible as the interpreter. And so the other comment that I want to pick up on is what Catherine Littler said about situating our work, not only just in terms of, say, CRISPR genome editing, but also in the broader context of artificial intelligence and also embryo model research, the great work that Jianping just described, and that there's a real sense by practicing editors out there that it is the work at the moment is systematic, but there's always the development of arguably basic science practices with embryos that will eventually come together with some of the work in the somatic, at least in theory. And so having the limit between somatic and germline, it has been productive, arguably over the last 5 years since we last met here at Harvard, in that there's been tremendous amount of innovation, tremendous amount of investment in the somatic side, as well as in the basic understanding type of work on embryo editing that has the limit of not transferring those embryos into wombs that has come about. And so that is a larger context for the type of work that we do. I did want to show also this building in particular, because it is actually, I think, a product of having limits on federal funded embryo research back in the 1990s, 2000s, 2010s that inspired the design of this building. So on one side of the building is actually a public institute called the Institute for Discovery that I'm part of. On the other side is a privately funded institute called the Mortgage Institute for Research, and the entire architecture of having it be side by side, actually separated by an invisible boundary, an invisible line that's just administrative, was to give researchers like myself the flexibility to move across the hall if a particular type of limit on embryo research impacted my work, such that we would have flexibility to do and give us freedom in some ways to do the type of scientific work without having to switch buildings, to switch, to a whole new type of administrative regime as well. Without having this type of architecture. This work also is, I think, a reflection of the history of the first experiments where they derived human embryonic stem cells, which is also in Madison. You can see kind of the Capitol building at the horizon there. And Jamie Thompson's work in 1996, 7, and 8 started working on primate embryo work to human embryo work, and actually was not on campus and was shifted to a lab funded by Geron, which is a private company, to support that type. So one of the stories here is that even though there are limits, there's also really creative scientists and creative ways in which the institution and the greater I think research community respond to them. And ultimately, we want to think about including the scientists as well, the practicing scientists, in having meaningful limits on the type of that can be done. And so, we've talked about category 3A, 3B, developed by ISSDR. a legal ban in Canada on embryo research past 14 days. I do think that scientists and the current research community have these types of arrangements such that they can have a primary site of research, maybe a satellite lab in the private sector, could be next door, it could be a continent away. But these are the types of practices that are happening. And I do think that really all of the work that's happening in somatic cell genome editing has this type of arrangement in as I would say status quo in how you operate one of these leading labs in at least American science. And so the idea that the limits here need to be circumscribed to a particular space, to a particular type of funding arrangement, I think may fall maybe flat if the scientists at the end of the day don't internalize and reflect on the principles and how responsibility is being put on their shoulders. So I'm going to stop my comments there and look for the questions.
Okay, so first of all, I want to just point out what a great ending that was to this conversation, Chris, since Chris has just pointed out for us how, in a sense, limits between, when we talked about Habermas in the public sphere earlier, I mean, limits between public and private, between the forms of participation and the forms of exclusion, as Ubaka put it, that are appropriate to them, are actually, as Chris pointed out, inscribed in literally the architecture of scientific research. And it seems to me that each of these talks in a different way has touched upon that, Sheila, with what's self-evidently visible and to whom, and what forms of authorized seeing are appropriate to that, and what sort of idea of what authorization, what political and moral authorization stands back of it, the way in which, the ISSCR gathered together the leading experts, in many respects, the extremely thoughtful people about this domain to make judgments, on behalf of an international, it's in a sense in the name, and yet in a way that entailed very significant exclusion for, various reasons. The question of whether those reasons are good or bad, expertise reasons, participation, etc. Practical reasons, it seems to me, is very important. And looking at Chris, your building, and I sort of was thinking, one of the supervening transcendental sort of elements that unifies those distinct domains, presumably, is the UW escrow committee, of which Chris is a member. So anyway, I just sort of wanted to point that out, and if that sees conversation, great. And actually, since I see Bob back of the room, and Betsy is also here, and you both are, have played key roles in doing that sort of oversight work at Harvard itself. I wonder if maybe you want to come into this discussion on that point, because how oversight sees, and on behalf of whom, and what the limits of oversight are in terms of jurisdiction and remit, also in terms of the sorts of questions that should or shouldn't be asked, and sort of who it's answerable to. It seems to me those are all very important questions in a domain like this, where, as Ubaka pointed out, one of the modes of oversight is to have oversight. But the way oversight sees, on whose behalf it sees, and so forth, seems like a critical but often unanswered question. Anyway, that's not a demand so much as an invitation, so you can take it or refuse it. But I'll just invite questions from the audience.
Have a microphone or?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Is that good? Yeah, I wasn't expecting that, and I also I just arrived, and so I don't know what the conversation has been ahead of time. So it's an awkward position to be in. But as I was listening to the talks, and I think about our own experience with the escrow committee, I've chaired it now for over 17 years, Betsy, I think you've been there the whole time too. It's a little ridiculous. But I keep coming back to this, and maybe you've already talked about this, the value or maybe even the principle of incrementalism, which is when you're going into unclear territory, go slow, you don't know what you're going to find, wait and see what happens, and adjust course if necessary. And there seems to be, to me, a certain sort of nice humility about that. It's recognizing that you don't know what might happen. And also it approaches these problems with a certain sense of curiosity about what might happen. I know you talked about the 14-day rule, but I mean, that seems to be kind of a great case to make for incrementalism. And you know, when I've brought this up sometimes, or even the discussions that we've had at the escrow committee, people would say, well, what, if you don't know what you're looking for, then, you know, how do you go forward? But I think that's also one of the advantages of it is you don't have to specify ahead of time what the problems might be or what the successes might be. You can wait and see. A lot of these cannot be anticipated in advance. And so this was some of the thoughts that I had just listening to the presentations about not necessarily looking for sources of moral authority or those sorts of things, because they're going to be debatable at best, you know, and in the absence of any sort of authority, being willing to venture into the unknown with our eyes open and curiosity.
Yes, please.
Thank you. So I have a question for Chris and Jianping. I think, Chris, you mentioned AI in passing. I keep reading, I'm a total layman in this domain, but I keep reading all these fascinating things about how AI research and foundational biomedical research come ever more together. And of course, for our topic here, that is raising some absolutely fascinating possibilities, because as we are worried about the use of embryos and embryo models or anything kind of in the organic neighborhood here, that could be a total solution to that, right? You make it all synthetic, it's non-organic, but then of course you have a completely different issue about boundaries that you're integrating AIs or synthetically generated, digital models, whatever, into the thinking about human life. And so, what is the research situation there, Iman? Is this really happening in your line of work? Are you anticipating this to be coming to a conversation, a context near us anytime soon?
I mean, yes, I think it's certainly on the horizon in terms of what funding agencies are excited about. So if you put data science, machine learning, AI, and genome editing, you have a higher likelihood of getting. One, because there's actually not many people at that intersection, and you might be, going into a domain that's, has not been explored as much as other domains. Practically speaking, there's a lot of, at least in my line of work, manual work by students and technicians that are hoping to be automated. The judgments about quality of your embryos, for instance, now can be put into a computer program that takes pictures, can say yes, no, throw it into the trash, for instance. But there is an art there. Can that really be done? There's also quite a bit of large data sets on omics, every type of molecular level, genome, transcriptome, epigenome, proteome, whatever else you want to say. You can collect that at higher time resolution. And so those types of data sets, we rely on quite a bit of machine learning to just help us make conclusions about biological questions or technological questions that we're trying to do. So yes, those domains are coming together. There's a push by NSF, for instance, for us to have our trainees learn more data science and be proficient in that. Whether there's a limit there about the degree of organic or inorganic type of decision making that's happening in this research. I would say we haven't really confronted or deliberated much, but if you want to take the 10-year horizon, I'd say the answer is yes.
So, yeah, I guess one thing. So yeah, I completely agree with Chris. So indeed, I think there's a synergy and integration of data science, machine learning, even with synthetic embryo models, or otherwise natural human embryo development as well. So let's just call it virtual embryo development. So this is an ongoing effort. In fact, I have one student working just forming in silico simulations, computation, applying computational tools, including machine learning, to simulate natural human embryo. So I think this is this will be another direction. I think where I guess there's a synergy between different areas, right? Human development, stem cell research, in vitro stem cell research, and data science, machine learning, and we'll see where this path will lead us. Sorry.
So my question is, maybe just bring things back to what you were talking about at the beginning, Sheila. Ubaka, I thought you had a really interesting. Can everybody hear me?
No.
All right. Yeah. Sorry. Okay, I was just angling it incorrectly. All right. So technology is fixed. So Ubaka, I thought you made a really interesting point about why science might potentially be problematic for those who are excluded. So you said two things. One was that if you're not part of the regulators or part of the participants of science, then there's more likelihood that you'll be experimented upon. And then the other was that the benefits of the science won't actually go to you. But I think the question that Sheila was raising was quite provocative and interesting, where it was, are we discerning the right things? Are we doing the right kinds of science? So, if it's a bad science or it's something that we don't want to be participating in, then there's a question of, well, is it good enough just to kind of become involved with that science or to reap benefits from them if they're in fact not benefits, if they're harms, or in fact if it's not a good science. So I just wanted you to maybe reflect a little bit on that and how you might answer some of the questions of whether something is worthy to discern or not.
Thank you for the question. I actually see them as not two different things. I think they're the same thing. I think each time you're asking about whether something is right or wrong to do, that binary to me suggests that you're discussing something that is in existence and that's a possibility, right? And what I was saying is, there's a chance that question will be answered differently depending on where you are, right? Some will be right, some will be wrong, as we've seen play out in this context, right? And the one question that's not asked is it necessary to even be talking about it? And if you're going to be talking about it, you have the right persons in the room to be talking about it. Right? So if you take, for example, should we use embryos for research? That suggests that there's a possibility to use embryos for research. It can be done, right? So in answering that question, what I like to see is an approach that doesn't sort of consider it as, if we answer that question as it's right to use embryos for research, then we proceed, or if we say it's wrong, then we don't proceed, right? What I'm suggesting instead is an approach that considers whether or not the idea of embryo research as a whole is necessary. I think the idea of necessity is different from sort of the idea of whether or not it's right to do the research or not right to do the research. And the necessity of it, I think, is what needs to be discussed more in my view, because that in itself is embedded in the idea of limits. If you think it's necessary to do it, or you're struggling with whether or not it's right or wrong to do it, eventually, as John's presentation suggested, you might start from it's not. Eventually, you might get to maybe it is. And then, okay, let's just do it. right? And in all of that, you not consider, well, is it actually what we should be doing? And that is really stuck. I think there's a limit embedded in that question of necessity. Now, to give an example sort of around that, we've done all this mapping of the human genome and those genetic studies that come from it, right? And along the way, we've had questions around what we can or cannot do with that data, or what technologies are possible or not possible. And there was a study published, I forget one journal now, but it was actually very much discussed in the community about the fact that much of that database that's been built will only support research in persons of European ancestry, right? So, first of all, you have to ask is how good is that science if it's only focused on certain types of genomes, but also that it will not benefit anyone, even if you get to, anyone who's not of European ancestry. So it's things like that I'm more worried about. These discussions about the kinds of limits embedded in that, as opposed to the question of right or wrong, which I can work themselves out eventually, or not if they get them, put in legislation and get fixed in time. What we started from the embryo debate is what we are right. And even if you don't go down the path of using embryos, I think human embryos for research, you might be on an IPS track, there are workarounds, but in all of that, we're asking, is it necessary? And the opportunity costs, that's the most.
Yeah, go ahead, Haru.
Yeah, thank you for this panel. I guess my question is to all four of you in general. I did want to bring up, Sheila brought up Roe v. Wade and the recent overturning of the decision. And I was wondering how it is that you're thinking about the moral politics of the decision in itself. So Sheila talked about sort of who gets to authorize the way in which knowledge is made and governance decisions based on scientific knowledge are made. But I guess maybe Sheila, if you could speak a little bit to kind of the questions of how it is that sources of authority themselves change over time, and how it is that different institutions become authoritative, or the kind of combination of religion, law, and science becomes really interesting, because this is kind of there are multiple institutions governing sort of the female womb at the same time, and it becomes really complicated. But there's a question about the recent decision. Is it sort of simply a product of changing institutional design of the Supreme Court, or is there a different kind of moral politics going on? And I was wondering what all of your views are on sort of changing authoritative institutions. Is it a change? Anyway, this isn't too specific, but just opening up conversation.
On that, the question of whether the Roe v. Wade has been overruled is still like the question of whether the 14-day rule is. Which I suppose is a question of authoritative institutions. So Sheila, you want to start it?
So I don't think that what I was saying about authorization is that who has the authority to decide. It's that it's not about who has the authority to decide. It is that at any given time in society, there are institutional domains that believe that authorization comes from one place or another place or another place. These institutions operate according to different views, and law has its own moods of fundamentalism, as illustrated in Justice Alito's leaked opinion, which I think scientists don't pay enough attention to because they don't understand the degree to which that mode of reasoning actually sets down law that's every bit as intransigent as whether biology will behave in certain ways or not. And I think Chris underscored this by saying that the material architecture of a science lab obeys the human-made law of what bodies like Chris can move about and do what in this state. So I think that it's important to recognize that there are modes of authorization going on that may be independent of one another, that have their own logic rules, their own language games, and their own sources of moral acknowledgement, recognition, or whatever. So that's one thing that I was trying to say in my overly compressed talk. A second thing that I was trying to say is that even if there is a text that people go back to, the way in which you choose to interpret that obviously is time dependent, context dependent, culture dependent. So the very same constitution that sits encased in the National Archive has been interpreted in two completely different ways about how it should adapt or not to Bob's question of incrementalism. And so the fundamental interpretation of the Constitution, which goes back to Blackstone, or a reading of Blackstone, is not the only reading. There has been a much more incrementalist, a much more live with time and adapt with time reading of the Constitution, which we seem to be rebelling against. I mean, that is what this alleged supermajority, I don't know where that term came from, but in the Supreme Court is actually doing, it's changing the interpretive rules of the game. And, there is a question what the analog in the sciences is. And maybe the analog in the sciences is about the way in which the 14-day debate is being carried on. And then I think there was a slight, maybe misunderstanding between Hilton and Ubaka, because I wasn't taking it as a binary. I was taking it more as how does one create the domain of what is the right thing to inquire into in the first place, such that one becomes either included or excluded? I mean, why is it that, or how is it that one set of interventions becomes the thing that everybody goes chasing after? It actually takes me back to, Francoise's comments about the who is at the table and who is the editor and who is the author, and so on and so forth. And, to some extent, I mean, now that Celia Bonacci is in this room, for instance, from a different legal culture where it is not the case that as easily you can simply bypass the public interest rules by saying, okay, we'll do it by private funding. I mean, I don't think that that sort of the creation of that Discovery Institute, whatever the name of your private part of the thing is, would happen as readily in every context. So how does one decide, which science is worth doing before even getting to the inclusion or exclusion inside of that science? I mean, we're all very used to the idea that, the provost of Harvard University has the right to pull together a committee that's called the escrow, and it meets kind of American standards of pluralism. And I'm on it, I don't know out of what view, because the university doesn't recognize SDS as a field. So I think I'm there as a layperson. I mean, so there's that sort of weird mapping of who the right people in the room are. But it's the escrow committee, which is embryonic stem cell research oversight, right? And when our committee tried to say, the questions that the biologists are throwing at us, they're not all about stem cells. They're about this other wider range of things that are about, how far should biology go in creating organoids and, doing these various kinds of interventions. It turned out that we bumped up against limits that I think I mean, of course we were aware of it. We didn't know how, how they would be argued. I mean, it turns out that universities are terrified of taking the lead and creating deliberative forums that are themselves ahead of the game in terms of what we should be even deliberating on. I mean, so it's easy to follow along in the footsteps that have already been laid down. Embryonic stem cells, so you do embryonic stem cell research oversight, and you can have your debates about, was this simply a political response to the American abortion politics, and you can go spinning that wheel 100 times over, but woe betide if you say, well, the things that are really worth deliberating are much bigger than the box of embryonic stem cells, because then everybody starts to worry that if Harvard outpaces other people in regulation, then the research funds won't come. And, as Ben pointed out before, that no university institutionally is willing to risk its access to biomedical research fellows by, sort of getting ahead of the game as it's understood to be in deliberating things. So these limits, they kick in and ordain even the scope. I mean, Ben, you had some apparatus of delimitation phrase when you talked earlier. And in essence, I was also alluding to the discursive side of that apparatus of delimitations that happen in different institutional settings.
We're pretty much at time, but I'll just invite the other panelists to have a final word. I can start with you, Jianping.
Well, I guess I would just make one quick comment. I think stem cell scientists or engineers, some engineers, we're just happy that the government, the previous government, the next government, they're not paying close attention to stem cell engineering.
So I actually see that as a raw exercise of power. I teach a class in a law science course on the history of regulation of the fetus and the embryo, and you need all the crazy ideas that moral philosophers, religious philosophers, Blackstone, all the crap they said over time reemerges in some form. It's all just people who are influential at a certain time. Thomas Aquinas, for example, said the male fetus matures, the male embryo becomes a person around 30 days, and the female is like 90 days, or something like that. It's just making things up. And these things emerge as authoritative at the same point in time. It's all a raw excess of power, in my view. Nobody has actually bothered. I think that's the way I feel about it. The rule, you can't explain it by reference to any philosophical principle that is enduring. So when you change it, you're going to have to change it by reference to whatever the group at the time agrees that you have to change it or not. But primitive streak, it doesn't make sense to me at least. I think that an excess of power among the deliberative committees that are not sometimes not well constituted result in long traditions of thinking that actually can be damaging.
Of course, saying it's just raw power takes you back to the question of who is empowered to make things up, right? I mean, Rachel's comment about tacit promising comes back to mind. Anyway, Chris.
All right. I mean, I guess there's a few provocative things that were said. I mean, so I think one of the questions is, how did the current moral politics affect, the practice of research, let's say, at my institution? And, I think about Rachel's comment about what's unspoken. We have an escrow as well. There's a question that actually a private entity, not part of the university, came to the UW escrow to ask about policy and guidance on embryo storage. Embryos that were used for research purposes, they're expensive to keep, but we're talking about this at lunch. How do we, show care for this? And, this is a private entity. They don't have to come to UW, which is a public institution. But I think, they want to be sure that they're thought as part of the moral community of doing, academic science. But they're also reacting to the greater backdrop. And, this weekend there was a Molotov cocktail that was thrown into a Planned Parenthood clinic in Madison, Wisconsin. That's an unspoken act. And it is, certainly an intimidating type of backdrop in terms of whether you want to be seen as going too far ahead, at least of the current political climate. So these are all part of, I think, the calculations on how limits stick and are interpreted in practice. I don't have a great answer to this, but I do think it is part of our conversation.
All right, so we've earned your coffee break. We will reconvene at 4 o'clock, but all that remains is to thank this excellent panel.